post-structuralist, text and discourse-centric pedagogical and theoretical models. Speculative realism is quite a diverse field, and I'll say a bit more about it shortly. But suffice to say, the crucial difference between that and the kind of post-structuralist thinkers and so on that we're used to is contra Derrida. For the speculative realist, there is something outside the text. So that's the first prediction. The second is that video games, or perhaps more generally like virtual worlds, won't just become a more kind of mainstream object of study. I think, first of all, if the 20th century was the kind of century of cinema being the defining art form of the 20th century, I think for this century it's going to be video games, if indeed it isn't already. And so this is to say that not just that, I mean, we already have video game studies as a growing field, but also that gaming, playing, these ludic attitudes are going to seep into all kind of research and thinking and our ways of thinking in the arts and humanities. So I say those two things with two caveats. First of all, I'm not a speculative realist, as you'll discover. And secondly, I'm not a video game critic. I'm a poet and a literary critic. And so I'm approaching this in a kind of spirit of Ludens, a spirit of play, rather than a spirit of Faber, making or working. So, this brings me on to Everything, which is what you're seeing on the screen. So Everything was let me just check the time. So Everything is a game that came out last year for the PC and the PlayStation, and it's made by an Irish animator and a very small team, Irish animator called David O'Reilly. It's a follow-up to a game that David O'Reilly made called Mountain, and in Mountain's a very small game. You could buy it for £1, and it would just, when you start Mountain, it says, draw your soul. So you have to draw your soul. And then it says, draw what death looks like. And then it asks another couple of questions. And from these little line drawings you do on the screen, it generates a mountain. And then the mountain, you can't interact with it. You can move the camera around, but that's it. The mountain just sits there in the background and does its thing, and occasionally talks to you in these kind of gnomic, existentialist text. And then later on, things start crashing into the mountain, all kind of like a giraffe and a carousel and all kinds of weird stuff. And then eventually the mountain disappears. It says, I'm done with this. And so it's not the player that stops playing, it's the mountain. So this was a wee kind of indie game that came out. It was really surprisingly successful, and it allowed O'Reilly to fund this much bigger project, Everything, in which it's been described as a universe simulator. And in it, you effectively get to be everything or anything. There are 1,391 things in the game that you can kind of become, and you the various controls are you can move around. You start as a rhino or some kind of animal, and then gradually you learn more controls, so you can sing to other objects and they gather around you and follow you around. You can make yourself bigger and smaller. Later you can change between scales, so you begin on a kind of human scale and you can move up to the continental, the planetary, the galactic, or you can move down to the kind of the small, then the atomic, and then the subatomic, and so on. So as you can see, it's quite and it also, it generates these weird kind of thoughts from time to time. And you'll also, some of the objects you come across, you can interact with, and they'll usually come out with these weird kind of anxiety-ridden kind of Camus-esque like utterances. So yeah, and it's got all kinds of objects, man-made, natural, also notably fictional objects, which I'll come back onto in a minute. Another thing that distinguishes it from most video games is that it doesn't have any objective as such. There's a kind of initial tutorial phase that you go through, but after that you really just, it's like a kind of sandbox game, as it's described, or an open world game. If there is an objective, it's to try and be everything, and I've only been about half of the things so far. Another really, and one thing that I'll also come back to, which is probably very significant to note, is that the only thing really notable by its absence is the human. That's one thing you can't discover and be as such, but I'll come back to that later. And also, if there's a narrative structure to the game, it's provided by these little sound clips that you occasionally come across by the pop philosopher Alan Watts, who kind of popularized like Zen ideas in California in the 60s, and kind of influenced a lot of the hippie movement and so on. So yeah, some of the kind of things you might find Alan Watts saying, he says things like, each one of us, and he has this like, you know, real kind of soothing voice, and you can hear the grain of the sort of 60s recording, and it's, you know, kind of hoodwinking, you might say, especially given the visuals and the ludic experience. And he says things like, each one of us, not only human beings, but every leaf, every weed, exists in the way it does, not only because everything else around it does. The individual and the universe are inseparable, or more kind of pithily, everything wiggles. So this is, you know, kind of pop, possibly quite trite pop philosophical, spiritual kind of panpsychism that Watts is presenting, and which the game tries to realise in video game form, as it were. Another really interesting factor, the reason that loads of cool things are happening at the moment, even though I'm not touching the controller, is that the game's got an autoplay feature, which is pretty unique as well. I mean, most games, if you stop playing for any length of time, you most likely get killed in a lot of traditional games. Or, like, if you remember Sonic the Hedgehog at the Mega Drive, if you leave it for a while, he starts tapping his foot and saying, come on, play me, play me. Whereas if you leave everything for 10 seconds, it will just start doing its own thing. It's like, it doesn't really need a player. So it's quite revolutionary in a lot of respects. And it's also part of this kind of growing scene of indie games, which, to my mind, it's a golden age for video games now. The technology is there and the resources are there for small developers to really start exploring the medium and pushing it in different directions. So, anyway, of the game, O'Reilly says, describing the game's connection with Alan Watts, he says, Alan Watts was the first thinker I ever encountered who I fully felt aligned with. The root idea he describes verbally is the same idea the game itself is describing. I would also say it is strictly an indescribable idea, but I believe games have the potential to describe it better than any other medium. So there's this effort through the video game to do something which O'Reilly believes that writing cannot do, which is to somehow get at this indescribable Wattsian vision of the universe, kind of panpsychist, Zen, if you will, vision of the universe. So that's everything. Now, I'm going to move on now to talk about a video game theorist and philosopher called Ian Bogost, who is self-described object-oriented ontologist, and it's a funny one. So I've only recently started reading around object-oriented ontology. I really want to call it object-orientated ontology, because that's the kind of British English way, but it's enough of a mouthful already. And the thinkers themselves associated with this nascent school describe it as triple O. I always want to say ooh, but you want to say ooh, don't you? But I'll stick with the orthodox triple O. So Bogost is a self-described object-oriented ontologist, which is a school of speculative realism. Now, Bogost, in his 2013 book, Alien Phenomenology, or What It's Like to Be a Thing, rails against writing as the way in which we disseminate our ideas academically. He criticises it on several grounds. First, he says academics aren't very good writers, they put too much fluff words in, and so on, a great deal of which I agree with. And he also criticises the culture, the academic institutional pressures of having to produce writing all the time and publish or perish, that kind of thing. As a kind of counterpoint to that, he proposes this notion he calls carpentry, which is, and I quote, the practice of constructing artifacts as a philosophical practice. He says, philosophers ought to get their hands dirty with grease and panko breadcrumbs and formaldehyde. For that reason, and so you might see, if the idea that is to create an artifact which will, if not philosophize for us, but render philosophical concepts and philosophical ideas in something alternative to writing, then you might very well see everything as an example of what Bogost calls carpentry. And you can see why Bogos would be really attracted to a game like Everything. He very favourably reviewed the previous game, Mountain, that I mentioned. And Bogos himself has a background in video game theory. He's a programmer and game designer himself. And of course, the subtitle of Alien Phenomenology, What It's Like to Be a Thing, suggests a real affinity with what O'Reilly's tried to achieve in Everything. However, excuse me a minute, you can just indulge in the visuals while I get a glass of water. So yes, do feel free to get distracted. I have no idea what's going to happen. Which is one of the joys of it, which I'll come back to in a moment. So yeah, but Bogos is actually very critical of Everything. He says, and describing what O'Reilly's doing, blending Zen and Vedanta with Freud and Heisenberg, Watts argued against the Western notion of the alienated self, separate from it and at odds with its surroundings. Instead, he advocated a holistic conception of being, in which all entities in the cosmos are fundamentally interconnected, reliant, and compatible. This is this oneness kind of idea. By contrast, Bogos, as an object-oriented ontologist, says, when I eat bacon, or view zebras, or feel the breeze from a desktop fan, or ingest the hydrogen atoms bound to oxygen in a glass of water, I partake of those things only in part. Their fundamental nature remains utterly separate and different from me, and from one another too. I might be made of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, but I can never really grasp what it is to be carbon. I might enter a fast food restaurant, and I might even leave with bits of it inside me, but I can never fathom what it means to be a restaurant. The best I could do is to tousle the hair of that question and establish the terms on which approximations might be possible. And this is one of his favourite words, tousle, and I'll come back to this shortly. So, contra Watts' holistic vision, Bogos kind of espouses a view of discrete objects, unknowable in themselves, associated with object-oriented ontology. So to talk a little bit more about, triple O, the crucial point, I think, of triple O and of speculative realism in general is that it's anti-correlationist. And Graham Harman, one of the kind of progenitor, if you like, of triple O, says, are human beings worthy of filling up 50% of ontology? This is the verdict of modern philosophy since Descartes and Kant, whose ideas entail that we cannot speak of the world without humans or humans without the world, but only of a primordial correlation or rapport between the two, a notion that Quentin Melisseau has justly attacked under the name of correlationism. So, there isn't, this kind of primordial correlation or rapport is a much weaker link, if indeed it is a link at all, than what Watts proposes, and it's for that reason that Bogos takes issue with the game. The alternative that people present, I can't help myself, is a flat ontology, and this phrase comes from another triple O guy called Levi Bryant. This is the suggestion that everything in the world, thoughts, things, concepts, everything is an object according to object-oriented ontology, and no object is any more real than the other. In other words, crucially, it doesn't privilege the human subject, the process of cognition, above anything else. It doesn't prioritize culture over nature or nature over culture or either of these things. Humans are not privileged, or as Bogos puts it, objects tousle each other. So not just that we tousle the objects, but they're tousling each other from their kind of discrete ontologies, their discrete beings. So I can't really go too much further into the sort of details of triple O, but that's enough to go on for the purposes of our reading, I think. So you can see why Bogos might take issue with the kind of Watts' holism. And so anyway, back to the notion of carpentry. Carpentry kind of grows out of a project that Bogos wants to do called ontography. And this is where we come into where J.M. Mills rears his head again, whose one of his stories begins... What did I say?
Yeah.
John Stuart Mill. How did I get that? Anyway, M.R. James, apologies. I suppose you will be getting away pretty soon, now full term is over, Professor, said a person not in the story to the Professor of Ontography, soon after they had sat down next to each other at a feast in the hospitable hall of St. James College. So that's this kind of comical, like, nonsense subject, Professor of Ontography. But then Bogos takes it quite seriously. He says, let's adopt ontography as a name for a general inscriptive strategy, one that uncovers the repleteness of units and their interobjectivity. From the perspective of metaphysics, ontography involves the revelation of object relationships without necessarily offering clarification or description of any kind. Like a medieval bestiary, ontography could take the form of a compendium, a record of things juxtaposed to demonstrate their overlap and imply interaction through collocation. The simplest approach to such a recording is the list, a group of items loosely joined not by logic or power or use, but by the gentle knot of the comma. And at this point, I'd like you to look at your handouts, which are covered in lists. So, on the left, you'll find a series of lists from various speculative realists, Latour, Bogost, Harman, and Tristan, what's his name again, Garcia. So these are all human-created lists. On the right, the first four are lists created with Bogost's carpentry, which he calls the Latour litanizer. So being very fond of Latour's propensity for peppering his prose with lists, Bogos created this machine that would would go to Wikipedia and randomly generate a list of random Wikipedia articles. So in other words, making the Latour litany genuinely random, or as close to random as we can reasonably get. And you'll see it doesn't really take looking at it, you don't really have to look at it too closely to see the distinction between the two. The human created lists actually use a lot of poetic devices. They seem to want to cover every one of the main class of objects, like fictional, natural, cultural, and so on. So there's this kind of pseudo-randomness, which is in sharp contrast to the real randomness of the Wikipedia-generated list of the Latour litany. However, and the final four lists, yesterday I made a little Twitter bot that would generate Latour litanies, but only from all the objects in everything. So you end up with Wikipedia's flat ontology in the first four lists, and everything's flat ontology in the latter four lists. And I don't have time to look at them too closely, but I think what's significant about them is that the kind of poetics of them is quite different. The consciousness, I think, is more obvious on the left side, as you might expect. And half of the things in the Wikipedia list, I don't know what they are, and perhaps never will. Although one thing I do really like, on the fourth from the top on the right-hand side, the fifth entry on the list says, "These are the facts." Which is apparently a 2007 album of a Sheffield band whose name eludes me, but I think it says something, I think, of our poetic human desire to find meaning in things that resonates quite a great deal in terms of what these litanies are trying to do, and some of the Triple O's sort of propositions and so on. It also reminds me of Wittgenstein, the world is the totality of facts, not things, so the kind of linguistic philosophy rearing its ugly head despite itself. So, to my mind, despite this kind of flatness that Bogost is trying to achieve with the Latour litanizer, I think rather than viewing correlationism as a purely philosophical prospect, I think what you find looking at these lists are what you might call a kind of poetic correlate. In other words, it's not just a question of truth, but it's a question of patterns and beauty that we can't help but see in these lists, whether that has been put there by a human or not. And that's one of the major problems, because I really want to be a speculative realist. I really want to get on board with it, but I find I have a real issue. Maybe I'm too modern, as they would criticize me as, and I can't get away from this notion that actually the fact that we're mediating everything means that I don't know. I'm still working on it. So Yeah, so anyway, but going back to everything, Bogos plays everything with a triple O mentality rather than a kind of Watts holistic one. And he finds that in fact it lends itself very well to that kind of reading. He says, for example, the game puts man-made entities on the same footing as natural ones, a kind of flat ontology there. He says also, and then speaking of the existentialist messages you get from the various things, he says, counterintuitively, by allowing things unlike people to pretend they're like us, the game helps drive home the fact that they are not. So for Bogos, it's not this holism, it's rather our discreteness that's asserted by the game's anxiety. Which I agree with for the most part, but I feel like one of the most interesting distinctions in everything, and you also see it in Latour's litanies, whether generated or human, is this distinction between a directed and an aleatoric engagement. When you play everything yourself, it's very difficult not to try and be going somewhere, not to be trying to collect something, not to try and go up and down. You're bringing this kind of consciousness to it, and the fact that the game will play itself without that, I think, is very cool. But I begin to have problems with this idea of tootling, and it's a funny one. The way he talks about it, it's like, oh, there you go, little bottle, on your way, like you would with a school kid or something like that, a little ruffle of the hair. But there's also a kind of violence inherent in the word tootling, and he never really fully unpicks his metaphor. To my mind, and this is my main criticism, is that Graham Harman, he says if it strikes you that human beings, however interesting we may be to ourselves, deserve to fill up a full half of philosophy, then you are already on board with triple O. Deserve to fill up a full half of philosophy. Elsewhere he says, are we worthy to fill up a half of philosophy? I'm not sure if the question is one of deserving or worthiness. Rather, it's a kind of fate that we're kind of fatally obliged to my mind. And so to me, that the tootling, Bogos tootling, I would replace with what you might call longing. And this could go back to Friedrich Schiller, who distinguishes between the naive poet and the sentimental poet. The naive poet, who he associates with the ancients, with the Arcadians, a mythical concept, is nature. And this is very much like Adam in the Garden of Eden, naming the things into being. There is an almost essential connection between word and thing. Whereas for the modern, or the sentimental poet, they will yearn, they will long for nature, they will long to be nature. But of course we can never cross that signified referent rift. So that, I think, is something in triple O that I need to get my head around if indeed I'm going to continue to get on board with it. So I'm going to finish up there, but just to say, in terms of the game, as Bogos says, it's a video game with a metaphysical position strong and coherent enough to warrant objection as much as embrace. And I think that's its strength, and I think, the fact that it's not just, O'Reilly presents Watts' reading to us, but we needn't accept that. Bogos takes quite a different reading from it, and myself, perhaps a different reading still. Nevertheless, I think it's, for that very reason, I think it's a great work of art, and I think it will continue to feed into thought and reflection and so on. So perhaps then, as a closing thought, if the dense, kind of infamously dense prose of French theory is, it's often said that the form of high theory in its kind of infamously impenetrable prose, captures the kind of the content. It kind of mimics the content in some way. It's deliberately difficult because language is difficult and discourse is difficult and so on. Perhaps if speculative realism does ascends as a kind of school of thought, perhaps that kind of discourse will fall into the back, to the side in favour of a more object-oriented engagement with ideas and with thinking through them. Thank you.